Hi, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Perspectivity. In this episode, we're going to walk through the life story of an amazing person, Brian Hogan, author of several books, including There's a Sheep in My Bathtub, Birth of a Mongolian Church Planting Movement. In this episode, we're going to walk through some absolutely incredible experiences that Brian's been through. We're going to trace how a person can maintain exceptional levels of hope and faith and positivity, even amidst extreme levels of bullying and having to become a very tough person to overcome those circumstances. We're also going to track someone's experience with faith in God, and we can explore how Brian became so dedicated to his mission related to Christianity and spreading the word of God because of how it empowered him and how we saw that empower the world around him. In this episode, I invite you to be as curious as you can be, stay open, look for the lessons you can learn, and come up with questions. If something challenges you or you hear something that makes you react in a certain way, positive or negative, note that down. That's part of the process. That's part of our learning. And please share in the conversation. Tell us what you think, what you learned from this experience, so that we can all learn together. Stay curious. Brian, I'm happy to be here with you today in your beautiful home. With my feet on your amazing carpet. Where's your carpet from again?
Airdnet, Mongolia.
Airdnet, Mongolia. I'm sure we're going to get to that. Today, we're going to go through a life story interview. We're going to walk through your life and the perspectives that you've accumulated along the way, just to illuminate, what it's like to be you, how you kind of came into this life, and so that we can learn from you and maybe learn about ourselves in the process.
All right.
So I guess I'd just like you to let everybody know. Name is Brian Hogan, correct? How do you identify, Brian? If you had to put a title with your name, what would you put?
Author and speaker. I don't know, a title like Mr. or Professor. I don't know. No, author and speaker.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Well, when we walk through this life story interview, I like to think about our life story as a series of chapters, just like a book. As an author, you've written several chapters. We have your books right here. And so I guess I'd ask you maybe to start with kind of early on. If you had to title the chapter of your childhood, what might you give it as a title and why?
Yeah, I think it would have to be something about being raised by a single mom in Burbank, California. That's kind of a long title, not very workable. I think on my titles quite a bit.
So double click on that. Why is that so significant to you? Raised by a single mom?
I think it pretty much set up the parameters of my childhood. A lot of the significant things came from that fact that we didn't have too much control over. My mom had to work long hours at Children's Hospital of Los Angeles, and so there were child care providers that had to take care of me before school and get me off to school. She'd find families that could do that or something and drop me there. There was grandparents on the weekend that I'd stay with, the grandparents who lived in our town, my father's parents. And so I guess a lot, and we had a live-in babysitter for a while. A girl from Illinois that came and went to college in California and stayed with us. I was in love with her.
Oh,
Yeah.
Was
She
that
was
your
only
first
11
love?
years older than me, and I really wanted her to wait for me. Her name was Patty Jean, and she was a hippie chick, and she was just a dreamboat. I thought the world of her.
Wow. Was that your first love?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah.
That's beautiful. That's pretty unique too. It sounds like you were kind of raised by a whole community there.
Yeah, in a lot of ways. I mean, there were two sets of grandparents. So one set had me for the summers in Illinois, and the other sets had me for weekends in Burbank. And they were surrogate parents, really. They took a very, very close interest in my life and raising me right and everything.
Wow.
Although they were very different. My dad's parents couldn't say no. So they just said yes to me at every turn. And that was probably not really great for behavior. My mom said it took about half a week to unspoil me every time I came home from their house. But my other grandparents were really good at saying no, and they were going to raise a fine human being if it killed all of us. So uh,
Oh my gosh. So you were
they were very
literally
loving, but they would be firm about things. And it's like one summer, my grandmother decided I had to learn my times tables, and boy, we had a miserable summer. But she was right. I did need to learn them.
wow. So you were consistently in this tension between
Permissive and
yeah.
strict. Yeah.
As a psychologist, I think about like the if you've ever heard of the Freudian id, ego, and superego, it's like you had a very clear superego group and a very clear pleasure group. That seems wild. What
And the
was
common factor was love. They were all head over heels in love with me. And I never had any doubt of that, no matter who I was with. But it was just very different, you know.
what?
At one grandparent's house, I had my subscription to Mad Magazine go there, and I had, I had guns I could shoot, and I had everything I wanted there. My other grandparents went with whatever rules my mom had laid down, and they were like, "No, are you kidding? You're not going to shoot a gun," this kind of thing. So,
Wow. Do you believe that you have worth and value no matter what?
yes, yeah, I
Wow.
do.
That's amazing that common thread that you mentioned that even though you had very different grandparenting styles, that there was that common thread of love. Do you think you experienced that while you were a child, or did you figure that out later?
No, I definitely experienced it while I was a child. I have one really clear memory. I was quite young. Um, I don't know exactly how old, but my grandparents were moving, and I think I was trying to help. They were moving into a new house. I was trying to help, and there was a box of dishes. I was trying to get it up closer to where it needed to be, and I dropped it, and most of them broke. And they happened to be my grandmother's china, and it was that and my grandfather kind of let out what it was because he was so horrified at what he thought his wife would be feeling at the loss of this, and my grandmother just rushed in and said, "No." I started to cry, and she said, "Things don't matter, Brian. You matter." And that was like, yeah, I remember it like it was yesterday. It was such a potent moment. I thought I'd destroyed the world, and she was like, "Oh no, that doesn't even matter. These dishes are just things made out of clay."
Wow.
Yeah.
Did you face any? You mentioned that the title of your chapter would have to do with being raised by a single mother. What was what was something that inspired you about your mother at that time?
Oh, my mom was, yeah, she was an amazing mother. She kind of, I mean, when her husband, my dad, left, she just had to pick up. She'd left the workforce so she could be a full time mother and everything. She was a registered nurse, and she had to go back to work, and suddenly juggling all these things. He wasn't really helping out much. There was a court ordered child support, which she put every cent of it into my college fund. She didn't spend any of it. So she was working to put food on the table. And I'd ask her, "Oh, can we have this? Or can't we go here, do this or something?" And she'd say, "We're broke. We can't do that." And I thought, oh my gosh, we're always broke. Now, we were broke with in her economy of, I know everything that needs to be paid and there's no extra for that. But I actually thought, it's like moths coming out of the pockets and everything, because when you're a kid, you're really literal and we're broke, you know? So, yeah, I mean, it was a struggle, I think, to make ends meet, keep up the house payments. And she always did that. And she, got more education. She got a master's degree from Pepperdine, and she went into nursing administration. And so there were pay raises and everything. So over time, we did better. But she always had time for me and took really good care of me. And I was challenging, the school decided that I was ADHD, or what they called at the time hyperactive, and there were problems with between me and the teachers and all of this. And she got really engaged with all of that, and forged a real bond with my teacher in first grade. And that lady ended up becoming really close friends with my mom and inviting her. We lived right across the street from NBC Studios, and so this teacher's husband was the producer of the Flip Wilson show, which was a comedy show with this Black American guy. And so my mom had tickets so she could walk right across the street and go to filmings of this show. And the teacher ended up liking me so much and being so devoted to my mom that she followed me into second grade. She became a second grade teacher so she could keep teaching me. And so I had the same teacher for 2 years, and that was wonderful. I love Mrs. Bacchus, and yeah. So my mom, she was pretty incredible, and uh, we'd uh, she was close with her family in Illinois, so we'd take trips back to Illinois and be with her parents and everything, and then she'd leave me with them so she could come back and work. And I had great. They'd take me all around the U.S. and take me to all sorts of different national parks and Land of Lincoln stuff and all this. So yeah, it was pretty. I look at it as an idyllic childhood, and yet there were a lot of painful experiences and significant things that happened along the way. There was eventually an abusive stepfather in the mix, and three stepbrothers that were all basically the same age as I was. So that was a kind of a huge shock to my little only child world. But I look back on it and said, I had a really great childhood, really enjoyed it.
Wow. What would you say the theme is of your childhood? Just reflecting on it now.
um, I'd say the theme of my childhood was that I was surrounded by a team of really loving adults. And so there was a security in that and everything. And when I got into all sorts of difficulties or problems, or, I've written a book about all the ways I almost died, and some of them almost killed my grandparents, uh, getting getting lost in the woods and everybody out searching for me, and then my grandfather finds me walking on top of a pipe with a wire across this gorge, and I was like 5. And he almost had a heart attack right there in the gorge, and he never went camping again for the rest of his life. So
That's amazing and wild. And yes, I've gotten into the book and seen some of the ways that you've almost died, which is absolutely crazy. I can also really appreciate what you said about a team of people. We've talked before this interview, and I've lost both my parents, and
yeah,
I was raised by a team of people.
right.
And I feel the same way that you even mentioned, that there was a lot of hardship and there were a lot of difficulties there, but at the same time, I felt like just so much love, and it was a really good childhood because I was so appreciative of all those people who stepped up on that team. I think it's amazing. What about when you got into your adolescent years, your teen years, kind of high school period?
Yeah.
What do you think?
Just before I say that, there's one thing I wanted to say. I think one of the things I've learned is that I've talked to people who look back on their childhood and see all the dark corners and see all the hardship, and they, oh, it was so horrible. And it always feels like to me they're overlooking the things you just mentioned, these wonderful grace points that if those hadn't been there, they never would have made it. And I look back at my childhood and I could search around and find dark, scary things or whatever, but that isn't my impression of it. My impression of it is that it glows and it was wonderful, and I'd go back and do it again. Uh, so I
Wow.
think a lot of it is what you choose to look at and what you see as most important.
I really appreciate that perspective because that's what's always shocked me. Growing up, I always felt like when I talked about my mom, I was always supposed to be sad, and that I was supposed to, because she had passed away, be broken. And it was a script I learned,
Mm-hmm.
that that's what it was expected of me.
That was a proper orphan response, maybe.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and I rejected it eventually. Um, And when I rejected that response, I started to see the beauty. I started to relish in the memories. I started to relish in
Mm,
the connection that I still felt spiritually to my mom.
yeah.
And my relationship with my mom, I mean, for most of my life, it felt like she was walking hand in hand with me. And it wasn't this terrible, awful, traumatic experience for most of my life.
Yeah.
And then other people will be like, yeah, but you can't do that. And I hear people say, you're always grieving and you're always this. And it's like,
It's not
Not
how it feels to me.
not how it feels to me. And also, if that's the case, shouldn't we look for that then? If this can happen, like what you're saying, I think
Right.
it's really powerful to look back and say, there was trauma, there was pain, there were experiences that if you heard about them, you would be like, I don't know how I could possibly get through that and be okay. And yet there's people who are going through them that are okay. That's not just an anomaly. That's something to kind of pay attention to, I think.
Yeah.
I love that about your story. So walk me through,
So the
yeah.
teenage years. Um, so a couple things happened at about the same time. When I was, I think, right a couple days after my 11th birthday, my mom married a guy that she'd been dating on and off for probably 6 years. And I had introduced them. He was the father of a classmate of mine in kindergarten. So, yeah, maybe longer than 6 years. And she had said no on a number of occasions to this guy's proposals because he had three boys who were all within 18 months of my age. One of them was the same age as me, and they were twins that were 18 months younger. And she was like, "There's no way I want four teenage boys in the house at the same time. I don't want to do this." And she kept telling him no, and eventually he wore her down, and she said yes. And I was like, "I want a dad," so I was partially responsible. I was advocating for it, and they got married, and it kind of brought this whole level of chaos into my life because he was very physical in his parenting, very, yeah, violent. He beat me. He actually broke my bones on one occasion at least, twisted a finger until it broke, bloodied me. Um, that was really difficult because I'd been raised with all the adults in my life just talking things out with me. I mean, there wasn't physical discipline in my life. Uh, and then his boys, there was all the issues of a step family, all the preference, they don't have any grandparents at all, so you have to share yours. And the grandparents have to be absolutely fair and have vacations with each kid and all that. So suddenly I went to sharing my whole world with people who weren't bringing anything to the table, at least in my eyes. And it was really difficult. And yeah, so that was hard. And then I'm going into that happened, I think, fifth and sixth grade. We moved to accommodate the larger family. We had to move to Glendale and get a larger house. And that happened when I wasn't even home. So I came home to a new house, never got to say goodbye to my old friends or my old house or anything. It was just moved. I came home from summer vacation. And 2 years later, I'm entering junior high and in some ways totally unprepared for it. The whole thing of teenage fitting in and being something that other people can understand or approve of or something. And I was a very individual. I mean, I just wanted to be whoever I wanted to be at that moment, and I didn't care what other people thought, which was a tactical error for junior high school, but that's how it was. And so I got beat up a lot, and I was getting beat up almost every day running home from school. I had to make a deal with the bus driver where he'd give me a running head start before he'd let the bullies off the bus to catch me and pummel me and all that. And it was very difficult. I was a victim for a whole year. And then the school vice principal called me in one time, and he knew what was going on. And he said, "Brian, I just want you to know that you need to fight back, and you will not get any discipline from this office if you get in fights. Normally I would, but this is the situation. These guys have to be put on notice that they can't do this to you anymore." And so I was like, "Oh my gosh, you know." So I just started challenging anybody who even looked at me wrong. I'd challenge them to a fight after school. And I fought literally every day after school for months. My knuckles were split open and they did not heal because I was bare knuckle fighting every day and they just stayed split open. They couldn't heal. And I had so many fights. And I won. And I eventually people were like, well, new people that came into the school were told, "Oh, you need to fight Brian Hogan and everything." But the people at the school didn't want to fight me anymore. It hurt too much. And then I didn't have to fight any in ninth grade. I just kind of rolled on my reputation at that point. But it was, yeah, the whole thing was pretty traumatic. Meanwhile, I'm getting beat up at home. And eventually, I got my grandfather, my dad's father, was just enraged that he knew I was being abused and there was nothing he could do about it and everything. And so at one point he said, "Okay, Brian, you're big enough. The next time Dave hits you or even starts to try and come at you, go at him twice as hard." And I was like, "Really?" And he goes, "Yeah, that's what you have to do." And so just waited. And the next time it happened, I just went at him and I pushed him backwards all the way through the house and held him over this chest freezer, bent him backwards, and just said, "You will never, ever lay a hand on me again." And he never did. He cussed me out pretty much every day for the rest of his life, but he never laid a hand on me again. So my grandpa was right. But yeah, that was all traumatic. But at the same time, um, I don't know. I look back on my childhood as being really good. So,
Wow.
and then my stepdad died when I was in high school, and so then it was my mom had to raise his sons, and that was hard and everything. But yeah,
Wow. Whoa, I thought I was interviewing an author and a speaker, but apparently I'm interviewing someone who could have been a world champion UFC fighter. Um,
I
that,
think it has to do with being in a corner.
yeah, that's really wild. So I'll just share an experience of mine because I'm curious what you think on your perspective with this history.
Mhm.
Not a lot of people have that feeling of standing up to someone who's a parental figure, because they have to. And I remember distinctly, I had a moment. My dad was very emotionally and verbally abusive. He was slightly physically abusive, but it was always by accident. He was
Mhm.
very drunk, and then
Out
he
of
would,
control.
yeah, he would accidentally hurt me. It wasn't like an anger hurt.
Mhm.
It was like a playful. I was young, and he would be
You didn't
playing with
have the
me.
limits in place.
Yeah, but that emotional was the thing that got me. And one time, I stood up to my dad, like I was gonna fight him, and
Mm.
I had a bunch of friends over, and he was doing something where he was blaming me for something he had done. He used to blame me for his drinking and
Mm.
his drug abuse sometimes, and only when he was mad because he had been using. He woke up, he's all hungover, and now he's mad at me because I'm just an irritant, right? And I remember standing up to him and being ready to like fight him. And we were face to face, and it looked like we were going to fight. And I remember the feeling of knowing I would win this fight. My dad was very weak by this time.
Mm.
It's like I would win this fight. I would be able to hurt him. And at the same time, just being so the trauma for me was the fact that I even wanted to hurt him.
Mm-hmm.
I think if he had been more physically abusive, it would have felt different because it would have been like fair.
Uh-huh.
But I remember that being something in my life that was the way I felt about myself in that moment was really hard to come to grips with. And everybody there was totally like, hey, man, if you would have done something totally reasonable, there's nothing wrong. But just, it was something where my worldview got shooken up because I'd never thought of myself even being
Mm-hmm.
in that position. Did you have any like lessons from those types of moments or
Yeah.
anything like that, or
I
shifts in your thinking?
I was I was basically a very kind kid who wanted other people to be happy, and I certainly didn't want to hurt anybody and everything. So when basically the administration of the school threw me out there and said you need to defend yourself and everything, I made a decision to do everything I could to kind of push that agenda. But at the same time, even though it felt good to win fights, particularly against bullies or something, um, at the same time, I didn't like being feared. I didn't like the whole aggressive thing, the stance that I had to take, and because it became such a daily thing, there was a time where it became out of control. I had a very good friend that I loved a lot, and his name was Scott Gilman, and he just said something to me after math class one day. We used to just cut up in there and get in trouble, and he got a bad report card, and his mom said she'd send him to military school. And I was like, I couldn't imagine that. My mom would never do that. I think my mom's dad one time had said, maybe you need to send him to military school or something like that, because I was getting in a lot of trouble and everything. And my mom was like, absolutely not. Well, that's crazy, Dad. So I laughed because I thought, this is a joke. Yeah, your parent would never send you to military school. And he was like, no, unless I stop, cutting up in here with you and everything, I'm in danger of this. And I teased him about it, which was very unwise. And somehow, I can't remember who threw down, but a fight got challenged. And we were going to fight after school. And we did. And I beat up my friend, and I felt so guilty about it afterwards. And for years. And I met him again at a reunion, and was, because he did go to military school. That was the worst thing. He disappeared a couple weeks later, and he was in military school. We never saw him again until this reunion, like the 20-year reunion or something.
Oh my
And
God.
so I was able to spend some time with him, go to a bar, and we just talked, and I apologized. I said I just had no idea, and I felt so bad about fighting you and everything. But before that, just when we moved into the new neighborhood, there was a kid in the neighborhood who was like the tough kid. He'd kind of carved out a thing for himself. And so everybody said, oh, Robert Chapman's going to fight you. You got to fight Robert Chapman. And there was this lawn down in the bottom of a cul-de-sac where all the fights in the whole neighborhood took place. And the whole neighborhood was boys my age. I mean, it was just this huge horde of boys. There were no girls in the neighborhood. Well, there was one, Janice, but she hated us with a purple passion because she was the only girl in the neighborhood. It was like Lucy Van Pelt or something. And so there was this fight, and I had never fought at all up to that point. I was 10 years old, 11 years old, and suddenly I have to fight this kid who lives 2 doors down, who I actually already really liked, because when we moved in, the welcome wagon lady had told my mom, don't ever let your son play with Robert Chapman. He is bad news. And so I was out the door and down introducing myself within a minute of her saying that. I thought he sounded like such wonderful fun. It's like she said, Huckleberry Finn lives 2 doors down. And it's like, yes, I have died and gone to heaven. So anyway, I liked this kid, but suddenly we were forced by all the other kids in the neighborhood to be in a fight. And I won. And I took his reputation from him and everything. And I could just tell he was devastated. So I went down to his house that evening, and he didn't want to see me or anything. I said, no, Robert, let's have another fight, and you can win, and then everything will be okay again.
Oh my God.
And so we had another fight. It was well publicized, and I let him win, and he said the first one he only lost because he was barefoot. And so I just let him win and be king of the neighborhood again. And we were great friends after that. In fact, I just saw him on a trip to LA about a month ago. We hung out.
This is incredible. Also, I had no idea we would end up here. Your story just helped me understand something I don't think I've understood for most of my life. One of the most traumatic experiences I've ever had was my best friend wanting to fight me. And the reason why is because I was in a conversation with someone, and they asked me if they were like, you could beat him in a fight. And my friend, he was a smaller guy, but he had an incredible reputation for being unbreakably tough. And I always touted that he was the toughest person I knew. And they asked me, they said, you could beat him in a fight, right? You're a lot bigger than him. I was taller. But they're like, you're taller than him. Like, you could easily beat him. And I was like, maybe. I was like, maybe if I got the right hit in early, I might be able to beat him. Maybe. That's all I had said. And someone who had said that, they had transferred that around, and word got to him that I said I could beat him in a fight. And to me, I was like, why would that even matter? Who cares? Like, to me, it wasn't that big of a deal. But for him, it destroyed our friendship. And we'd been best friends since like 1st grade. And this was 7th grade. We'd spent all this time together. We stopped being friends, and it broke my heart. I mean, it was the
Mm-hmm.
hardest thing for me. He was my brother. I couldn't understand how this was in between us. I tried to figure out a way to make it up. There was no way to make it up. And then we ended up at a place where a bunch of people were fighting. And after the fight, he came up to me and tried to fight me. And I, for a long time, had in my head, like, you don't fight family.
Mm-hmm.
And I was like, there's no way I would fight him, win or lose. I could never do that. I couldn't live with myself if I did. In my head, I was like having a conversation with my mom, and I felt like she'd be so disappointed in me if I did. And literally, he spit in my face.
Mm.
And I was sitting there, and that was the first time where I almost did fight him. And I don't even know who would have won, but I felt like I was like, oh, okay, like, and then I was like, I was just sitting in that, and I felt like my heart was just breaking. And then I let him do it, and I took it, and I was like, I can't believe he's doing this, and I don't know what was going through his head, but he was just destroying me because I was more torn up by the fact that I can't believe you could do this to me.
Right.
And because I could never do this to you. I would never do this to you. So I'm sitting there. I try to get up. I keep trying to walk away, and he's tripping me, and he's calling me names, and he's trying to get me to fight him.
Mm-hmm.
And I just keep going until finally I walk away, and I can't believe what's happened. And I get to some people afterwards who are like, you could kick his ass. Why didn't you kick his ass? They're like, I don't know if I could have. I actually don't. I personally, I don't even care to consider whether I could or not, because that didn't matter at all to me.
Right.
I didn't care about who could win a fight, like you didn't care about winning the fight with this friend of yours. But what was crazy is what I didn't realize. He lived in the trailer park. He didn't grow up in the trailer park. In his early childhood, he lived with his grandmother, and then they moved to the trailer park. And it was a rough place. I didn't understand how important that reputation was
His
for him.
His place in that pecking order was way more important to him than it was in your mind.
And it needed to be there because if he showed weakness to me,
there were others coming for him.
It could easily happen. But he had all this respect. So even the toughest guys, the people who were definitely could severely hurt either of us, those people just had respect for him.
Mm-hmm.
And he had to show them, like, I'm not going to let this slide. If he said he could beat me in a fight, then I'm going to kick his ass. And I've always wondered, I never thought about that. I always wondered why that was so important to him. I don't know if that's the case. I'd love to ask him. But now I realize what I did, even in that conversation of saying, like, I might be able to be, that was a much more serious thing to say than I had ever considered, and it shows something I didn't understand about my friend.
It was a much larger challenge than you could even think of it as. It came to him in that way. It makes you wonder, had the situation presented itself, could you too have figured out a way to maintain the status quo in his favor? I mean, because that's what Robert and I did, basically. I wanted to be friends with Robert, and I didn't care what the other kids in the neighborhood thought when it came down to it. If I was friends with Robert, I'd be able to play and, cul-de-sac football and all the different things in the neighborhood. Nobody was going to really mess with me. Robert was the one who was supposed to mess with me, and we'd already settled that. So we both knew he was never going to challenge me again. So this fake fight that I was going to throw was the solution. And it made us co-conspirators. And we were thick as thieves after that and got in lots of trouble together, but it was gloriously fun.
I've thought about this a lot. A large part of me wishes that I just would have fought him and win or lose. Because if I would have beat him, I don't think I would have, honestly. I think he was a very tough kid. And I actually would say that. I'd be like, you would beat me in a fight. Like, I was saying if I got lucky, I would win the fight. And so I was like, if I won, I don't know what would have happened. But if he beat me up and I took that pain and we could just go back.
Restored the friendship probably, huh?
I just wanted my best friend back.
Open to it.
He still, means a lot to me. But I love that about your story. I'd never even thought about that whole reputational side of it. So thank you for that. And also, wow, how you were as a kid, like, you know what, let's just fake a fight and we can be friends and it'll be cool. Like, what way to see beyond the drama or the veil with that. That's pretty wild. Does that happen normally in your life? That you kind of see through everything like that and find a creative solution?
Yeah, I think there's been other instances of it. I'm trying to think. One comes to mind right away, and not coming up with anything. But yeah, I don't. It doesn't seem unusual or a one-off to me. Um, so I think the most challenging thing is as we age, as we grow into adulthood and everything. All of us, I'll include myself in this, but it seems like everybody gets additional layers of insulation between them and other people. And some of this stuff requires a kind of a rawness, like, it's right there against Robert's skin, so to speak. I mean, we were just two kids and there was hardly anything. You could just say something really direct and it'd be received, whereas adults are thinking about a whole lot more issues. And it's actually even harder to come in real contact with each other sometimes. So then everything becomes a bit more challenging to work through.
Wow.
We just get more complicated. When you're a little kid, it's like, oh yeah, that would fix it.
Yeah.
It's like, really? Because it's easy. I can do that. Don't hit me
Yeah.
too hard, I'll scream and, fall down. So,
That's I really like that because part of what we're doing right now on this tour is we're thinking about, well, okay, how do we see ourselves as Americans and what would it mean to be American? And the reputational concerns. America's
ah,
the tough country that nobody can mess with. And it seems like maybe there's a lot of people who are, like you said, you didn't want to be someone who everybody feared. That wasn't your goal.
right.
There's a lot of Americans, I think, who don't want to be the
Ooh.
feared, I'm the tough country that can't be messed with. They completely reject that.
Robert was a Brit. He was born, he lived in Britain until he was like 7 or something, and then moved to the US. In fact, he wasn't circumcised. And so as we went through junior high together, one of the things that came out was that we had nude showering.
Yeah.
That was normal back then in junior high. And he was very self conscious and had been teased. So he got circumcised as a 13-year-old. And it was incredibly painful. And I remember sitting there and he had bandages and everything, but they were under his clothes. But just talking about it and how traumatic it was, and he couldn't go to school for like 4 days.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah.
Yeah, this whole idea of how we mold ourselves to fit into culture, and then sometimes we're like, I don't want to.
Yeah.
Wow. Okay. So teen years, I I gotta be honest, you completely surprised me with the all the fighting. I did not know that you had to go through
Oh,
that, and it's really nice to hear about. I could imagine if I didn't know you at all, and I was a kid in that class, there's probably someone who just saw you as this person who fights all the time and is bad news because they're always fighting. And they have no idea that it came from you having to make a deal with your bus driver to get a head start to run away from people who are beating you up.
yeah.
That's, to me, that's the amazing thing about how even now I can think, oh my gosh, I can think of people in my life who I see as they're always fighting, they're always causing trouble that I didn't know. Who knows what they were going through?
Yeah.
That's wild. So okay, as you go through your teen years, you start to head college years.
Well, and
Yeah,
one of the interesting things was that in high school, just I didn't change. This insistence on here's who I am gets a whole different way of being looked at. So yeah, I was not going to get into the cool cliques, right? But I found a group of friends. They were all in a rock band actually called Grim Reaper. It was a heavy metal band, and they had long hair, and then they changed, and they were doing kind of a New York Dolls glam rock thing, and they were called Mary Poppins with a Z. And they actually opened for Guns N' Roses at the Whiskey A Go Go as teenagers. So they were good, and they played a lot of parties, and like they were at the same parties as Alex Van Halen. The Van Halen brothers just lived in the next town over in Pasadena, and so that's the world that we were moving in. But I just really liked these. I wasn't musical at all. I like to sing, but uh, we were just really close because we were kind of outcast slash cool. Nobody knew how to place us, and people would come up and try and buy pot from my friends because of how they looked. And my friends didn't want people to know that they had never tried pot. So they would just direct it. Oh, you need to go over to Binky. He's got it right now. Normally we'd have a supply, but and I was like, what did you just say? We don't sell pot. And they're like, yeah, but they don't need to know that. So, we just had to end. So being quirky, being different and everything became, at least to some people, an asset. And then it's the most amazing thing at the class reunion. The most common thing people came over, people who wouldn't give me the time of day in high school, people that just rolled their eyes and walked away or something, came over and said, I admired you so much because you were the only one who didn't care what anybody else thought. And I was like, you admired me? You never gave me any cause to think that at the time. Yeah, good act there. So,
Wow.
yeah, so I really enjoyed high school. Ended up, I was difficult in the beginning, but because I had this great group of friends that were actually really like in the like Strider in the In It Bree, they looked foul and felt fair. They didn't drink, they didn't do drugs. They just looked like something that crawled out from underneath a rock.
Wow.
And because of that, high school ended very well for me. I was like a California Honor Society, National Scholarship Federation, straight A's. Got into a very impacted program at Cal Poly, California Polytechnic at San Luis Obispo. It ended really, really well, and I enjoyed it. And so it's just interesting that the same thing that was basically social death in junior high kind of leveraged into my favor in high school. And I think maybe the people around me had matured a little bit. And, maybe even if they were all trying to fit into something, they said later that they were admiring the heck out of me for not caring about it. And so the whole thing became a kind of enjoyable experience.
And it sounds like you were able to remain unjaded. Like you might have had an edge, but you weren't completely jaded about the world, it seems like.
No, no, I was I
Wow.
was a very much a idealist. I was a environmentalist. I was never going to drive a car, and I went every year to the Yosemite Institute with the school for a week in the winter and learned about nature and wrote poetry. And yeah, I was really, and I was part of Tree People. On weekends I'd plant trees in the mountains above Los Angeles, and uh,
So at the same time, and I think
I
people,
collected herbs and made teas.
wow, I feel like people, this is a common theme I've been seeing across this tour, is that sometimes even when you have a really rough challenges that you go through, as long as you can find something to give you hope and meaning and a mission, you can maintain that positive feeling about continuing on.
Yeah,
And you don't get stuck there. You see it as like a definitely want this to go away, and there's a future still.
yeah.
That's absolutely incredible. So, how did this, you go on, you start going into college? What would you say is the big kind of transition there?
The biggest transition for me between high school and college was right at the end of high school, the end of my senior year, going into that summer, just weeks away, maybe a month away from graduation. Um, I had a profound change in my life where even though I had my life pretty compartmentalized, so I had this great group of friends, and they were school friends, and then I had neighborhood friends, where I lived, and Robert, and but he'd gotten really into marijuana, and I never tried it even, and I was proud of that because my school was such a drug-soaked school. It
Mm-hmm.
was listed #1 in the United States in High Times magazine in 1979, Crescenta Valley High, and so it was a point of pride that I'd never tried pot because practically everybody had, and it was a way to be a rebel, I guess. But
Hard to be a rebel when everybody's doing it.
yeah,
It's,
but I did
you
get
were the
in,
rebel.
right. That's the only way to be a rebel if everybody's doing it. So but I did get into drinking, and mostly with 100% with neighborhood friends because my school friends didn't drink at all. And they didn't really know that I was into drinking until they played a party on New Year's, and I got really, really drunk there and walked into a pole and broke my glasses, and they had to help me home, and I was throwing up in their car and all of this, and that kind of opened their eyes to the fact that maybe Brian has a problem with alcohol, and So I was feeling, I guess, leading a double life, where I'm one thing to one group of people and another thing to another, was really poking my guilt receptors, which were very finely tuned growing up in Methodist Sunday school. I did know when I was doing wrong. I had a sense of right and wrong. And my idea of God was that you had to apologize and then he had to forgive you. But I didn't really have any kind of close personal connection. It was mostly the statutes and the things that I'd been taught. And I think I could nod back then to everything I believe now. I just, it wasn't personal to me. It was something I'd learned in Sunday school. And so I got guiltier and guiltier. I felt bad about myself internally. Didn't really, couldn't share it with anybody. One group would have laughed in my face that I even thought it was wrong. And the other group I was trying to hide it from. And so it created this dissonance inside that got worse and worse and worse, to the point where I'd say I was a pretty happy kid in person up to this point, but it got to the point where it was making me consider, I was having hopeless thoughts, suicidal ideations, maybe I should end this. I don't know how to get out of this. I made promises to God, which I would then instantly break, like sometimes within hours. And then that made me feel so much worse, because it's like, how do I go back? He remembers, he has a good memory that I just promised I'd never do this again. It just got worse and worse. And so I was at the end of my rope, and I was riding. I had a moped because I would never drive a car. I was such an environmentalist. I had a little moped, and I rode up to a friend's house, and this friend we called Basketball Head. He had a round head, so we called him Basketball Head, but his name was Don. And his mom was the coolest person ever, because she'd let all these disreputable rock kids hang out at her house all night long. We'd all sprawl all over the living room floor. They had the only VCR of anybody we knew. So we'd watch videotapes, movies, and their son worked at Straw Hat Pizza. And so we'd eat free pizza. We'd help him close up and make all these pizzas. We'd spell out like sex in pizza dough, or make a giant flying V guitar out of pizza dough. And then we'd bring all this home and just eat pizza. There'd be a just total mess, and she'd have to like step over us to get to the kitchen. And I'm like, this lady is so cool that she allows us to be here and be together. My mom wouldn't allow it. She wasn't cool in that way. She was like, no, hell no. Go. You have homes. So I thought Mrs. Trousdale was just the best. And so I went there, and she was crying. I went in, and Don wasn't there. I'd gone to see Don, and his mom was crying. And why are you crying? And she said, my husband and I felt like we'd heard from God that we were supposed to take our savings and invite in this evangelist, a guy named Lonnie Frisbee, who was a hippie, who was part of the Jesus People movement, long hair, beard, baptized tens of thousands of people at Corona del Mar, miracles, all of this. We thought we were supposed to bring him in. So we rented the Glendale Civic Auditorium, and there's been a series of meetings there, and nobody's coming. And we lost all our money. There's one couple who went in on it with us, and I think we heard wrong, and she was just weeping. And I said, oh, Mrs. Trousdale, don't cry. My friends and I'll be there. We'll come to your meeting. And I volunteered my whole group of friends to come. And then they were like, no. And when I told them, I was like, you have to. And I just totally guilted them into it. I was like, Mrs. Trousdale, so good to us. And how dare you? All you have to do is go down there and sit in a seat and listen, and everything. So we all trooped down there. And this meeting was pretty sparsely attended. It was growing a little bit. They'd been doing it for a week, but we got our seats there and everything. And I don't remember what the guy said exactly. I remember the worship band was great. It was a country bluegrass Christian band called Crystal River, and it was the first time I ever felt like I'd been singing directly to God and that he heard me. I just never had that experience before with hymns and stuff like that. And so when he called us to come down for communion, there was a long line, and I went down. My friends didn't know what to do because they had no background or anything. But I was like, I had first communion. I can have communion. And so I went down, and I'm in line. And he wasn't talking to anybody. He was just giving each person a piece of bread. And when it got to me, he held the bread on my forehead and said, I'm praying for your need. And it was like being hit by a lightning bolt. I kid you not. It came out of the ceiling, went right through the top of my head, and went through my whole body. I felt like I was being electrocuted, but I didn't feel any fear. And then I felt completely different. And I kind of staggered back to my seat. And this guy came running up from the top of the auditorium. He came running down to where I was sitting. And he said, I just saw the Holy Spirit enter you like a bolt of lightning. I'm like, you saw it. I felt it. It must have happened. And I mean, I was completely different. Everything I had been unable to say no to suddenly was gone. It was like it never existed. I felt like a new person. And I started telling all my friends about it, and they saw the change. Within a week, my entire group of friends had come to faith, and we started a church. I didn't know what else to do. I just wanted to meet with them, and I couldn't imagine taking them to church with their long hair and their eyeshadow and everything. I was like, no, that wouldn't work. And so I went to the local Methodist church I'd never even been to, didn't even know, but I knew where the pastor's office was. I went in there and walked right by his secretary and started talking to the guy. And I said, hey, my friends and I, we just all started following Jesus, and we need a place to study the Bible. Can we use the room that's on the second floor at the end of the balcony? It's got couches and it sounds, oh, that's our youth group room, he said. You want to join our youth group? No. Oh, you don't want to come? It's on Wednesday nights? No, we'll use it another night. I just want to use the room. And he goes, are you going to come to church here? No, no, we wouldn't like it. You wouldn't like us? And he kept asking me things. And finally I said, look, doesn't all this belong to Jesus? He's like, yeah. And I said, then just give me the key. I'll give it back when we're done with it. And so he reached behind him and he gave me the key to the room. And I didn't know this was weird or unusual. Later on, I looked back kind of horrified, like, oh, he should have kicked me out on my ass. But he didn't. And so it's like, we used that room, and we didn't know we were having church. It was so, everybody just kind of brought what they had. They'd share something that had happened during the week that they attributed to God, or we'd play an album. I had two Christian records, two early Christian rock guys, Larry Norman and Randy Stonehill. We'd play a record and then read the liner notes, and there'd be a verse reference. So we'd look up the verse in the Bible, and we go, oh my gosh, and we'd talk about it. What does it mean? Everybody'd share what they were feeling, and we'd pray. And one girl would draw a picture every week and show us all, and it was a picture of Jesus or something. And it was great. It was just like house church in this room with couches. And yeah, that was my first experience. And then I went off to college. So after that summer, so we had this glorious summer together, and then I went off to college and joined a really neat church there. And I always felt like I was at college so I could go to this church, not the other way around.
Wow. So one thing I want to bring up for
Mm-hmm.
people listening to this, if you're not religious and you've never been religious, or you've never had an experience like this, especially where you have a personal relationship with God,
Yeah, I didn't perceive it as religious.
Yeah, good point. This could sound absolutely crazy, this idea of the lightning bolt. And I've shared with you before our interview that I've had a similar experience, and that the lightning bolt, that's exactly the kind of, yeah, when you're saying that, I resonate deeply.
The guy, Lonnie Frisbee, who prayed for me, he wrote an autobiography I got on my Kindle, and I'm reading about it. His mom came into the back of one of his meetings. He's this radical hippie guy, His mom comes into the back, and he prayed for her from the front, and it happened to her. And he describes it exactly like it happened to me at his meeting. And I was like, I thought I was the only one.
Yeah, there's something to this. And for people who are following at this current time, I would not identify as being Christian. However, I will say that exact experience that you had, it is unbelievably powerful. And so if you're not religious, it's one thing to consider that this is an experience that people have. And it's the thing that keeps me thinking I might end up following perhaps Christianity again, or just following Jesus again, because it's a really crazy experience that you have. And it is exactly life-changing. Suddenly you go from, I'm hopeless and I don't feel like I can get control over any of these things that I'm trying, making promises to God and breaking them. Mm-hmm. If you're not making those to God, maybe making promises to yourself and then breaking those over and over again.
Same sense of hopelessness. It's like, I'm not going to be able to keep this. My
Yeah.
experience proves that I can't make
Yes.
myself any better.
Yes. And then it's why I'm a coach, because there are times where you can have a true breakthrough where you are in a moment. Now, who knows what all leads up to that moment, but
Hmm.
in that moment you shift, and all of a sudden not only do you feel like you can do those things you couldn't, you actually do.
Yeah.
And you see this where people quit smoking and they've never been able to do it, or they quit drinking, they've never been able to do it, or they can't get themselves to get up and search for a job, and all of a sudden they can't, they're the best worker in the room for the rest of
Yeah.
their life. And it's like, wow, how does that happen?
Yeah.
That's so powerful. And I don't want people who are intimidated by or have a negative feeling towards religion
To discount it.
to discount that experience, because it's a powerful thing. And if you want to understand why religion is so powerful, or at least following Jesus for people can be so powerful, I think a large part of that, I'm coming to learn, is that they have this inside transformative experience that is just so undeniable, and they're so grateful for it.
I think it's worth pointing out too that I had wandered away from my religious upbringing, which was in the United Methodist Church, as soon as I was allowed to. So maybe at 15, I started putting my feet down and saying, "Yeah, I'm not going to drive." We were still driving over to Burbank across the hills. We never found a church in Glendale, and I just didn't want it anymore, and it wasn't attractive to me at all, and everything. And I didn't have any sense of rejecting belief or anything, but it wasn't well integrated into my life in any way. So the beliefs were still there, but they were just on a plane that didn't have a whole lot of tendrils connecting to my everyday reality. And so when this happened to me, it didn't happen in any kind of a format of church or organized religion at all. And I didn't identify with that. So that was the only thing I could think of, was we need a place to meet. This church should provide one, but I didn't want to be part of it. I never went to a service there, not once, and never saw the pastor again. And so, and then when I went up to college and I did get involved in this kind of brand new youth church, it was all college students. It was kind of came out of the Jesus People movement. The pastor wore shorts and flip flops, and it was that kind of thing. I really resonated with it and everything, but I never thought, and to this day, I never thought that the Sunday meeting was the main thing. For me, it was always getting together with a couple other people, maybe as many as 10 other people in a living room. And for me, that's always where church has taken place. It's just a gathering of people, and everybody gets to participate, everybody gets to play. We're not an audience. And so I've always felt like that. And it's always been uncomfortable to me when there is a clear requirement that you be part of the big Sunday thing. And you can't believe how much of the time I skip it because I'm getting all my needs met in these simple house gatherings.
Wow. All right. So you've had this amazing experience. You transitioned, you've got college. I want to I want to shift to something we've talked about, but we haven't brought up in this interview, which is you ended up going about a pretty intense mission as it relates to this same type of church experience
Yeah.
that you've been talking about. And I'd like you to tell us about that. Tell us a little bit about what you did with that.
Well, Louise and I, my wife and I, got married a week after graduating from college, and it was it was a very unconventional courtship. We had never dated or anything. We knew each other from a big group that we were a part of, 60 people, nothing special. And I saw her in another city where I didn't know anybody at an event, and I just wanted someone to hang out with who knew who I was. So I walked up behind her, and all these people were crowded into the aisle leaving, and I couldn't get around in front of her and introduce myself. So I just reached around from the back and pulled her back into my chest in a hug, and I whispered in her ear, "So when are you going to marry me?" Just thinking this is a cute way to say hello to somebody I haven't seen in several months. And she turned around, saw who it was, and she said, "So when are you going to ask?" I was like, "Whoa." And so I thought really quick, and I go, "I guess I'm asking." And so we went off to a restaurant with some of her friends, and we whispered about this. We didn't want anyone else to know because we thought they'll think we're insane. Well, we whispered about it and thought, the right thing to do is probably to fast and pray. We shouldn't just make a decision like this so off the cuff. And so we decided to fast and pray, and we stopped eating. And I knew the next morning, so I was able to break my fast at the traditional time, which I call breakfast. And I called her and said, "Hey, I think we're supposed to get married. I really feel it. I prayed all night, and yeah, we're supposed to get married." And she goes, "Yeah, I haven't heard yet." And so she fasted for like a week, and I was like, "Oh my gosh, I maybe I need someone who makes quicker decisions." But then she heard the same thing, and so we got married 8 months later. We got engaged without ever having been on a date, and
What
people said it wouldn't last, but here we are 37 years later.
what is it when you say you heard? What is that experience like?
So I've actually it's differed for me in different circumstances over the years. From if you want to make a what are one of these called, scale, from the just getting this growing sense that you can't deny in answer to what you're asking about, and you're like, now it's gotten to the point where I can't even think of the opposite answer. It's just not there. This is so clearly the direction I'm supposed to go. So this growing sense, I'd put that at one end of the spectrum. You can't even pin down the exact, you never heard exact words or anything. It's just this growing sense. To the other end of the spectrum, which is, I would say, audible voice, although I would have to say that if somebody were sitting right next to me, it might not be audible to them. It's kind of hard to know if nobody's sitting next to you, but it's seeing you, feels like you heard something. Maybe you heard it inside your head. Maybe nothing actually hit your eardrum, but that's what it seems like. You know the exact words. It came to you in sentence form, it's this communication. And so I'd say that in this one circumstance, as I was praying all night, it's probably a 30% on that side of the scale. Then there were times where going to Mongolia, and getting involved in missions and everything, it was like we had this clear spoken word that just fully formed in our head, and go, okay, this is what we're supposed to do.
So walk us through you. Thank you. Also, this is crazy in the most beautiful way. I'm so inspired by this idea that you just felt a level of certainty. As a psychologist whose training is in really persuasion, one thing we talk about is a model that talks about how we make decisions based on how much confidence we have. And that is the way the model works. It's that once you hit a certain confidence threshold, there's a clarity and everything else goes away. And I'm really interested in the idea of how spirituality can help bring that clarity.
Right.
Because you could make that same decision without any prayer,
Yeah.
without any fasting, and you might get that clarity, or at least
true.
the feeling of it, right?
Uh-huh.
And sometimes it could be deceptive.
And sometimes you question your decisions later. So it becomes really important to have this very clear directional thing that you could kind of, I don't know, people talk about, the old Jews used to make a pile of stones to remember where something happened. Like, this is where we stepped into the river and there wasn't a river there anymore, or something like that. They'd make a pile of stones. And a really important life decision like this, you really want something that's clear enough that when bad things happen later and you're prone to question it and go, how did we get here? This is pretty awful. You go, but we knew beyond a shadow of a doubt this is what we were supposed to do. So now it's an issue of trusting that God will bring us through it, because he's the one who brought us out here, and he didn't bring us out here to destroy us. So Louise praying for 5 days, we talked about it so many times afterwards, and getting this steadily growing acceptance and knowledge that this marriage was what she was supposed to do, and that was really important, because her whole family came out against it. They didn't understand it. They were Roman Catholic, and I wasn't, and I wasn't an engineer, and her dad was a rocket scientist, and all her brothers were electronic engineers and stuff like that, and they were really against it. I was not their choice, and they pulled out of the wedding, and I mean, it was a very big kind of battle. They were using every kind of persuasion they could use, and she knew. She was like, well, am I going to live the rest of my life knowing I said no to what God wanted me to do so I could please mom and dad? And so that was really important that she took enough time to know that, because she could never actually question it after that for the rest of her life. And we've gone through a lot of hard times. And the first year of marriage was super tough. You know, people say, oh, it's like a dream, like a honeymoon. It's like, wow, what planet are you from? It was really hard. It's two selfish people learning to rub up against each other and not get their way. It sucked. You know, eventually it gets better because you're ground down.
Wow. That's so, what I'm hearing from that is that we all have, going back to the idea, we all have a ways of getting to clarity, and some of them are reliable. For some
Mm-hmm.
people, maybe a spiritual path to clarity is the most reliable, whereas there's clear paths like alcohol. They're like, how many people get drunk and they're very sure, I want to sleep with that person. And then they
Right.
wake up and they're like, why did I sleep with that person?
As one of my daughters said, no good decision is made after 2 a.m.
Yeah, right. And so, thinking about a lesson I learned from that, spiritual or not, is that the way we come about clarity in our decisions is really important, especially when things get hard.
Mm-hmm.
Which
Yeah,
that's powerful.
because that's when you want to come back and question and pull apart everything, and you end up turning around halfway through, which usually doesn't end well. You know, I
Mm.
mean, if you finishing something out is where the victory comes, if you will, the good things come. You're able to look back. We went through some incredibly hard times in Mongolia, and we look back now, this is 25 years later, and say, gosh, I'd do it all again, even though some of the worst things of our life happened during that period.
Wow. So when did you? Let's go to Mongolia.
Mm-hmm.
Take me there with you. When did you guys go to Mongolia? How'd you come about the decision? What was the mission?
We had 2 years into my college experience, I had what I consider a call to this kind of work. I was just alone in my dorm room reading a magazine, and it was a magazine about some remote tribal group in the jungle, and I just began to weep. And it was not because the article was particularly well written. I was an English major, and I knew it wasn't. So, you know, it was this huge kind of internal response, and as I tried to analyze it and everything, I felt like, no, what I'm feeling is what God feels about these people. That He wants to know, that have no idea where He is, who He is, how He is, you know, and all that. And so I thought, well, I want to do that, whatever that is. And I didn't even have a good definition in my mind of what missions was. Our church didn't do a whole lot with that. You know, I don't know if I'd met many missionaries at this point or anything, but I knew that I was supposed to do that, and so I just started doing whatever came to was that whatever I heard about. I did inner city work. I worked with Jews for Jesus. I'm not even Jewish. I had a shirt that said Goyim for Jesus, or Gentiles for Jesus. Anyway, just different things like that. Whatever I could, trying to kind of narrow down, what is this? What is this call? How do I respond to this? And so when I married Louise, that was a big part. As we talked with each other, both of us had to have a call to missions, and she did. But we still didn't know what it was, and we ended up working with juvenile delinquents in Las Vegas. We moved to Las Vegas, and we're part of a boys' home there for delinquents, and really loved it. And I thought, okay, it's urban work, it's inner city work. It wasn't, and I came to a place. We had moved back to California, didn't have a job, or had a job that was kind of ending in a weird way, kind of a corporate way. The boss gave my job to his daughter after I'd done all the hard work of setting the place up. It was a home for juvenile delinquents. And so I was like, this sucks. I don't know what I'm going to do next, but I don't really want to stay here as line level staff in the place I created. So Louise went into the school placement. I don't know what you call it. It was for graduates to help them find jobs. Everything was kind of all pre-internet, but they'd get all these listings and they'd print something out for you and you could go through. And I got all the jobs that I was qualified for printed out, and I went through them. None of them looked interesting to me at all. And I circled one. It was teacher on the Navajo Indian Reservation. And so Louise called on it, and they were so excited about us and our credentials and everything. She had basically accepted the job of dorm parents for this residential school for Navajo Indians before I got home. Uh, and so I was like, what? And she goes, we're moving to Arizona. I'm like, what is this? And she goes, just talk to the guy. And I'm talking to this old Irishman who was the head of the mission, Tom Dulligan. And he got me all excited. And so a month later, we were out on the reservation. And it was this amazing thing. And we fell in love with the Navajo people. We got an experience to live with them and learn their culture and everything, not knowing, having no clue that God was preparing us in 1987 to work in a country that was impossible to go to at that time, Mongolia. But the Navajo culture is almost identical to the Mongolian culture. They come from Mongolia. They live in the same houses. They herd sheep. They ride horses. They're genetically the same people. They have the same haplogroup as the Mongols. So they were the last group to come over the land bridge from Asia. And they displaced other Indian tribes. They were Mongol invaders of the North American continent. The Aztecs actually were too. They were a group that kept moving further south. So we didn't know that we were learning Mongolian culture. And then there was this guy there in our training who all he could talk about was Mongolia. And he said, I'm here to learn how to be a missionary to Mongolians. I don't care about the Navajo. We're like, you're really weird. He goes, no, it's the same culture. And he's explaining all this stuff to us. And I just thought he was really weird. But then later it all kind of started falling into place for me. And then Mongolia opened up just like this guy said it would. And we were ready. And so we changed gears and moved to join a team that was forming in Mongolia.
Wow.
And we had 3 small children by that point.
Wow.
And Louise had never been outside of the United States.
And so you did it. You decided, okay, we're going to do this.
Yeah.
We're going to go to Mongolia.
It's open. Let's go.
And so Mongolia was closed because
Communism. So communism fell. The government fell. And then they got a democratically elected parliament. But I mean, everybody in it had been raised in communism. Nobody had an experience of the free world, free market, capitalism, democracy. Nobody. So it was all brand new. And Russia pulled out, so there's no food in the stores. It was a dire situation.
Wow. So Russia was in control of Mongolia?
Russia was their big brother. Yeah. They pretended like it was an independent nation so they could field an Olympic team and they could do all these things and say, see, this is the Soviet world. We have all these independent nations like Belarus and Ukraine. They weren't independent at all. They were part of the Soviet Union. And Mongolia even had this fiction of having its own government. But Moscow made all the decisions.
Wow. Oh, wow. So there was an illusion of freedom.
Yeah, well, not freedom, because you'd be killed if you said anything that the government didn't like. They didn't, no, it was an illusion. There was an illusion of independence. But even the Mongols all knew. It's like their first leader, who was their big hero, went off to Moscow and was poisoned and sent back in a box. If you didn't toe the line, and that happened to a number of their leaders over the years, you start getting uppity and you were put down like a diseased dog.
Wow.
So
when Mongolia opened, I mean, was this a clear decision or was there any
they had a bunch of, you mean from their point of view, they had a bunch of people go out into the central square in front of the parliament and just, I mean, thousands and thousands of people. It was as the walls were falling in Eastern Europe. They had their own quiet revolution. Nobody was killed or anything, but the government just panicked and gave up. And said, okay, free elections, we'll lay down power.
Wow.
And nobody even noticed in the West because Mongolia was completely off our radar. It was such a closed country for 70 years that nobody even had been there. And I have a 1962 National Geographic had a whole article about Mongolia because one Supreme Court justice was able to visit there on a very controlled trip, and National Geographic did half the magazine on it because nobody knew anything about Mongolia.
I can tell you, prior to coming and spending a couple days here with you, I knew nothing. And even now, I've learned so much about Mongolia. I had no idea. It was off my radar entirely. And it's shocking to me to hear. It's weird to think about this. It's something that I need to spend more time with. To hear about the Ukraine conflict recently has brought to light a lot of these issues. It's made it more public. But even then, that issue is usually a country is being unfair to another country. We don't think about like 40 years ago, even now, that there's countries that are they really can't hear information. They can't go listen to the podcast that this is on.
Yeah.
It's impossible. I mean, they have to sneak around to do it, and they could get killed for that kind of action. And you were bringing a Christian mission to Mongolia, right? So what was that like? Because I know at least in China that would be very dangerous. What was it like in Mongolia?
So part of the government giving up was actually the United States Republican Party, the older George Bush, so George Bush, the dad, sent his reelection committee to help them, at their request, to help them write a new constitution. So they got the Bill of Rights enshrined in their constitution, religious freedom, freedom of speech, all that. And it was a donation from George Bush. He was just like, okay, I want to help these people. I can't just say I believe in freedom. And then there's an opportunity to help an entire nation of 3 million people. So he sent his reelection committee, and he lost the election. When they should have been working on getting him elected, they were in Mongolia. And nobody knows that. But that, no matter how you feel about the older George Bush, who's dead now or whatever, that's something laudable, that he gave up self-interest to help somebody else.
Wow.
And, I mean, probably other people question his timing. It's like, oh, you were trying to get reelected and then you didn't, how stupid was that? But
wow,
that was the time that they needed help.
Wow. So when you got to Mongolia.
So yeah, they had religious freedom, but they didn't know what it meant yet. I mean, nobody had a personal experience of it. Tibetan Buddhism, which had been 70 years ago, been the national religion, had the country in a death grip and was pulling it down below the waters for the last time, because you had to give your sons to the monasteries to be raised by these monks. And so the birth rate was plunging. Mongols weren't reproducing.
So, whoa, I've never heard any of this. So when I hear about Tibetan Buddhism now, it's always people
Dalai
who are,
Lama.
it's all about the freedom of learning to be present and to cope with your mind. I have not ever heard anything about customs of giving your sons to monasteries or anything like that.
Well, it had been a theocracy for 400 years. So Tibetan Buddhism came to Mongolia quite late, in the 1600s. It's younger than Lutheranism in Germany. Germans have been Lutheran longer than Mongols have been Tibetan Buddhists. Before that, they were animistic and shamanistic. And so when they came, they established like a god king over Mongolia, this Lama king who lived in this Bogd Khan palace and everything. And the monasteries, the monks, controlled everything. And so to name your kid, you had to go and pay the monks big money, and they'd give you the proper name for him, which was a Tibetan name that the Mongols didn't even know what it meant. There were so many things. They had to do ceremonies for you. They had to remove curses. They had to do all these things. And they made a lot of money, and they made really nice monasteries all over the country. And to keep them filled and keep their power, there was a lot of pressure put on people to have their first few sons become monks. They'd go there and have their heads shaved, and they'd be raised by the monks. But, just like the Roman Catholic scandals that have come out, this was not a good atmosphere for children. Let's put it that way. Raised by a bunch of celibate older men, supposedly celibate older men. So basically, venereal disease was rampant. And these kids were sterilized. So even if they made a decision as an adult to leave the monastery and maybe get married, they'd never have children. Their seminal vesicles were scarred because of VD and everything, because they'd been raped repeatedly. And so the Russians were horrified when they took over the country, basically. 1921, there's a communist revolution. The big brothers helped them win their revolution. And communism is atheistic. So they're like, we're shutting down the monasteries. When they looked at them and realized what was going on there and realized, oh, great, we have a new border country buffering us from China, and their birth rate is literally falling into a sinkhole. There's not going to be a country here, and the Chinese will just come across. The Russians are like, oh, no, you didn't. So they shut down all the monasteries. They machine gunned all the priests over 18, and they sent all the younger priests home and defrocked them and sent them home. And there was like 1 or 2 monasteries kept as museums. But no Tibetan Buddhism was allowed for 70 years. And so the whole country was scientific atheist. And they were very proud of it. They had really rooted out all religion. There had been no other religions there except for Kazakhs in the far west who were Muslim.
This perspective, so whenever I think about history, there's always so much to history. I've never even heard anything around like I don't know anything about Mongolia really, other than you go back to like Genghis Khan, and that's like all I think about.
Which
So
they're very proud of. They love Genghis Khan. They wear little pennants of him and everything. He's their favorite son. He took over the world. I mean, of course they're proud of that.
fascinating. This is so fascinating to understand that history and that context. And I'm sure there's people who would hear this and they'd be like, first of all, whenever you say the things like these intense things were happening to the people, there's times where anybody psychologically would be like, that can't be the whole story. That can't be it. Because a lot of people, a term we use in psychology that we study a lot is something called a belief in a just world. And actually more than 50% of the population usually will endorse beliefs that the world is just and fair. So if that was happening to them, either A, there's more to the story, or that's not true, or there was something that caused that pain that people are responsible for. And it's a pernicious belief in psychology because people will look at someone who goes through really bad things and they're like, the world's just and fair, so this doesn't make sense. And so I want to bring that up. If you're listening to this, and this is the first time you're even thinking about the history of Mongolia and especially the modern history, this could be really tough to even come to grips with. And I'd like to encourage anyone listening to just imagine, right, that this is the not a cue to be scared or run away or be like, whoa, it's a cue to get curious and say, oh my gosh, well, why are there so many atheists? If you're religious, why are there so many atheists who are vehemently against religion? Well, if this is the kind of history that they've had, or at least that they've come to believe, of course you're against religion. It was I'm well familiar. People wrote about this in the Catholic Church. The Life of Lazarillo de Tormes is a great book that illustrates how there were places where the Catholic Church was just controlling the whole society.
I think if you look at it from the standpoint of it was brought in as an introduction in the 1600s, and then it very quickly, because of the weakness that China had attacked Mongolia and thrown off Mongolian leadership, and so Mongolia was this conquered people, and then Tibetan Buddhism was allowed to be the client state of China and have all control within the borders of Mongolia. I think most people would agree it never works out very well when an organized religion has temporal political power over everybody within the borders of a place. So suddenly your religion isn't a thing that people choose anymore or something. It's imposed by actual law from above. And I think we would say this would probably be a bad situation for Christianity to be the legal only way running a country, to have the Pope as the God King of, Germany or something like that. We'd say, well, that would be a negative. That wouldn't be a good thing either, or any religion, countries that are run by an Ayatollah, for example, tend not to be nice places to live.
This is amazing thinking about your mission, because I'm tracking the theme of the small house church style that you chose, because you grew up Methodist, you would attended a church, and then
brick and mortar.
And then when you decided to choose this path again after your lightning bolt experience, now it was about this small connect. It was a choice connection. And you know what's crazy? I'm even seeing the theme from the things don't matter that your grandmother said when the china broke. It's like, that's not what matters. You matter. The church, the big brick and mortar. And we're in the South now, so I'm seeing these mega churches that I've never seen before.
It's not if you go to church, it's where you go to church.
It's cute. Yeah, these things are crazy. They're bigger than most football stadiums I've seen. And
well, that's the other religion, though. The football stadiums are temples.
That's true.
Here in the South.
But I'm seeing that, and I'm like, I'm tracking that theme. And when you went to Mongolia, right, your mission wasn't to build a giant church, right? What was the mission?
Well, I mean, simple things. Our mission was to introduce people to God in such a simple way that it could spread organically. They could tell their friends about it, and it would spread. So one of the things we learned was that simple things reproduce much better than complicated things. For example, if you take two elephants and put them in a large room and you wait 3 years, at the most, at the end of that 3 years, you'll have 3 elephants. They will have one baby. That's the most elephants can reproduce in 3 years. It's due to certain natural laws set in elephant flesh. But if you take 2 rabbits and put them in a room for 3 years, all other things being equal, food and everything else, at the end of that 3 years, you will have 476 million rabbits through normal rabbit reproduction.
That's fascinating to even think about tracking the complexity of a being on the basis of how fast they can reproduce.
So if you're talking about an organization, a really complicated organization, you can imagine if you were part of something, I don't know, it doesn't matter whether it's religion or not. If you're part of Apple Computer and you're challenged as an employee, hey, go out and start another one of these somewhere. You're like, what kind of budget am I going to be given? What kind of property are you going to give me? This is this huge campus. It's very complicated. We got tons of people. Actually, we got subsidiaries all over. And how could I do that? I'd need engineers. I'd need parking lots. I'd need, all of this. Well, it's the same in the church. Most Christians challenged to go out and reproduce are like, how would I do that? Look at this place. Like you were saying, it is huge. I'd need parking for the pastor and the pastor's wife and a youth group room with a pool table and, all of these things. It's too, but if their experience is a group of 6 or 7 or 10 people sitting in a living room sharing a life with each other, and then they're like, oh, this group's getting too big. I'll start another one. Well, everything that happens there is something they know how to do. If they've been there once or twice, they know how to do it because it's simple. And simple things can reproduce very easily. And so that's what we wanted to bring was just a knowledge of God where people could, because they had nothing, they had no clue. They'd say, who's Jesus? Is he an American? They just had never even heard. And then that they could gather together, and reproduce this, pass it on to whoever wanted it. There's no force. We didn't have any force. It wasn't like Tibetan Buddhism in 1920, where they could say you have to be, or we'll just take you out and kill you, leave you in the desert or whatever. And so there's no force at all. It's just whoever wants something different than what they've known. And the young people in particular really wanted some kind of change. They just felt very empty and they were looking for any kind of change. I think if we'd come in and said God was Michael Jackson, they would have all been doing the moonwalk, to be honest. Okay, they were ready.
Okay, so the younger generation was really receptive.
Yeah, they were super open.
How about the older generation?
The older generation was almost the opposite in the fact that not one of them really responded when we showed this movie called the Jesus Film and stuff, and we do exit interviews and talk with people. Younger people are all down front, asking for prayer and everything. The older people are like, that was a good movie. I liked it. They're very interesting. And we're like, yeah, and they go, it's almost as good as that Schwarzenegger one, Terminator. It's like, yeah, okay, but this one was true. So there's that. And they're like, no, it's not. It's science fiction. And there was just this. And I found out over time by asking a ton of questions that one, there was a huge reluctance to commit to some new idea, ideology, belief, or anything brought in by foreigners, because that's what they perceived the Russians as having done to them with communism. Karl Marx was a German, Lenin was a Russian, and they were like, these people hoodwinked us, and it all fell apart. It didn't work, but we sacrificed everything and then got nothing, and our stores are empty, and this kind of thing. It was all a lie. And so they didn't want to be tricked again. And the other problem was that the Bible translation that had happened, the New Testament translation, the guy didn't know what word to use for God, so he made one up. And it was cobbled together of a couple terms, and it meant master of the universe. And the older people were like, this sounds like science fiction. So that's what they thought it was the same. I've never heard of master of the universe. It's like, may the force be with you. It didn't resonate with them. And we realized after a lot of questioning, we agonized over this, but there was a perfectly good Mongolian word for deity, for God. And it had been rejected by the Bible translator because the Buddhists had used it 400 years before. And it's like, or 500 years before, whatever, when it, 1600, yeah, I guess 400 years before. And he rejected it because he thought, well, they'll get confused. Borhan is the word. But Borhan's a generic term. It means whatever you worship. So it could be a little idol on the dashboard of your car or in the corner of your house, or it could be the uncreated creator of heaven and earth and everything in between. And it was like, dawned on us, we have an English word that's exactly like that. It's called God, right? You can use it for anything. If you worship your car, that's your God, right? Or your bank account or whatever. So we just realized, let's use the Mongolian word. And it was when we changed God's name, we made a decision because we were living in the back of beyond in the third largest city, but it was way out there. All the other churches were in the capital city. So we could do things, we could experiment and not get in any trouble. And so we changed God's name. And that same week, a team came from Russia and asked if they could do stuff in the community, minister from a Bible school in Russia. We said, sure. They started praying for sick people, and everybody they prayed for was suddenly, visibly, and instantly healed in front of a huge crowd of onlookers. And this changed everything, and older people began to swarm into the church. And it's like they'd been waiting to hear it explained in a way that made sense and didn't sound weird to them. And then, is it true? And the fact that, prayer in the name of Jesus was bringing lame people up out of their beds where they'd been for 10 years, healing deaf people, healed a boy mute from birth who was 21 years old and he had full language instantly. And everybody knew him. He was the mute guy of the city. Everybody knew this guy, and he just started speaking. And so older people just swarmed in the church. Overnight, we went from being a church of almost all teenage girls, because we'd start out with teenage girls and they won their friends to faith. And so it's like, we're stuck, to having all ages and being the only church in the country that had all ages.
When you say this, like when you're telling me that people are being healed miraculously, that to me is where my brain like stops. And I was deep in religion and I trusted and believed that Jesus could do that at a point in time in life. But that's where my brain stops. It's like one of those, like, it's like the lightning bolt moment. Like someone who's never experienced the lightning bolt change through their body. I've experienced that. And so for me, when you say that, I'm like, yep, I understand. I could almost see that as a miracle.
Yeah.
But when you start talking about the miracles that are even contained in the Bible happening in like present day, I'll be honest, my brain stops. And I would bet you other people listening to this would be like, now I don't believe it.
Yeah.
Now it's like saying that the fried chicken down the street is the best you'll ever have. Like if you said it's really good, people would be like, okay, yeah, try it. Best I've ever had. Like you'll never have fried chicken better. It's like, for some people, that's where they're stopping. I'm like, you're blowing smoke. So what do you think? Like, if someone came to you and they told you, I can't believe it. What would be your response to that?
Well, first of all, I'm not unaware of what you just described. So I would call it a temptation. There's a temptation to leave that part out or to falsify the story a bit to make people feel okay with it and use other things that are true that were happening to kind of explain what happened and the change in response we're getting. It's like I don't have a responsibility to convert someone to be a believer that people get healed. They'll figure it out if they ever really need healing, and God does something about it. So, but on the other hand, it's like, this is what happened. It's my experience. Your thing is called perspectives, and and there were a number of us were there. It wasn't just Brian and the Mongolians. There was a Swedish couple. There was other people on our team. There were a number of other foreigners in the country. There were tons of Mongolians. Everybody in Erdenet knew about these healings, including the 90+% that didn't come to faith. They all knew this was happening because these were people they were very familiar with. The first lady who was healed was a dancer who was on Mongolian television all the time, up until 10 years before when she'd injured her back in an accident and had been bedridden ever since, paralyzed from the waist down. So everybody knew her. They'd watched her on their TV sets. She was part of the national dance troupe. And she was a famous woman. And this mute guy, he had grown up in the community. Everybody knew there's this guy who can't talk. And so it was almost like, looking back on it at the time, it was like vast excitement and confusion and everything. The crowd grew by the minute, as you can imagine. People were running in and running out, grabbing their families and coming back. And it was actually a fairly dangerous situation that we had not discerned at the time, because the Russian women who were doing the praying, Russians were hated in Mongolia at that time after the fall of communism. And we had sent them into a very dangerous situation without really thinking about it or realizing it.
Wow. And I appreciate you walking through that, because I think that's exactly the goal of this podcast and this interview style, is to find experiences that challenge us, that sound like that seems unbelievable to me. Do you write about that in your book?
Yeah,
There's a sheep.
It's all in there.
There's a sheep in my bathtub.
That's the whole story.
Birth of a Mongolian church planting movement, which they actually translated into Mongolian, right?
Yeah.
Which is, I mean, this is incredible to even look at all these words that I don't know, except sheep is ba, which caught my eye.
Sheep is hone. Because they're not in the same order. It's a different language.
My God.
So it's mini ban dotor hone, which is my bath inside sheep.
This makes sense.
Which doesn't make any sense if it's a direct translation.
I was like, how could sheep possibly be called ba? And I was like, that's what we say in English. That's wild. So if people want to learn about these experiences
these books are available on Amazon.
I will definitely put it out too when we launch this episode, a way for people to see this, because I think it's quite insane how much of a movement sparked from this. If you just studied this from a movement perspective, which you guys were able to do. Yeah.
It's one of the things that people study, and I'm called to do podcasts about, or I teach in classes about it or whatever, because it's kind of the classic case study of how something can just start out small, 14 teenage girls, and basically go across a whole nation. And now Mongolians send missionaries all over the world. In fact, per Christian, the Mongolians send out more missionaries than any nation on earth.
And they didn't even have.
And they didn't even know who Jesus was in the beginning of 1990. So.
Wow, that is absolutely wild.
In fact, I just got back from a national missions conference in Mongolia where I was the main speaker, and they gave me that statue up there of a Mongolian man on horseback, and it says Mongolian Missions Consultation on it and everything. It's huge, in the second largest city in Darhan. Wow. And it's become this big movement that's international now. There's Mongolian churches in Denver and Washington, D.C. and San Francisco, big churches, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of people. And they're all over the United States. And this was a country that didn't have any Christians at the start of the 1990s. So.
Wow. Now, I have a question that came to me while you were talking about bringing Christianity in as a choice. What's your perspective on, let's say that you had a Muslim missionary group who wanted to come into Mongolia and do the same thing at the same time? What is your perspective on that?
I can actually speak directly to that. It wasn't Muslims, but actually it's very similar. It's the American version of Islam, which is the Mormon faith. They came there. It's led by a prophet, multiple marriage, all of these kind of things are in place. It's a later revelation, like the Quran was a later revelation, the last prophet. Joseph Smith was the last prophet. He's got a later revelation. Anyway, they came in and they met with us. They came to our house and they were asking us all these questions. And we were aware of what they'd been saying because everybody in AirNet knew us. We were the only Americans in the city until these Mormon missionaries came. They're coming to us and saying, these people say they believe the exact same thing as you do. They just have a little bit more information and everything. So we just talked to them about it. They wanted to ask us all these mechanical questions about where do you baptize and stuff like that, try and, set up their thing. And we just kept talking to them about, actually, we just kept sharing our experience with them and saying, I was a waste of skin. I was in such bad shape, and God saved me. He loved me when I was still a sinner and everything. And they couldn't. After a while, they said, "You're right. We don't believe the same thing. We believe that it's our works that make us good enough that God would
Mm-hmm.
accept us." I'm like, "Yep, that's not what we believe. We believe that
Mm-hmm.
God already has this ridiculous, over the top love for us that's not based on anything we've done."
Mm-hmm.
And that, out of that acceptance and love comes all sorts of possibility of change and growth and everything. And so they were like, "Wow, that's not what we believe." And so then we said, "Then stop telling the Mongols that that is what you believe. If you tell them you believe the same thing we do, you're taking away the freedom of religion they just got 2 years ago. Because
Interesting.
if you lie to them, that's taking away freedom. Instead, we're is supportive of you being here if you want to be and saying whatever you want to say. Just be honest. Let them choose. That's what freedom is.
Oh,
You get
wow.
to choose."
Yeah.
And so what I've thought about this a lot, and it's like the big difference between Islam is that in most places where Islam is dominant, you are not allowed to leave. It's a one-way door. There's countries that flat out, Pakistan, for example, you can convert to Islam, but you cannot convert to any other religion. They can kill you for it. It's a death sentence. And so basically, Islam says, it's like Roach Motel. Roaches check in, but they don't check out. That used to be their tagline for the advertisement. Not for Islam, but for Roach Motel. Anyway,
Mm-hmm.
uh, raid. And so, but in Christianity, it's more like, yeah, you want to leave? Leave. Don't let the door hit you in the butt on the way out,
Mm-hmm.
because we don't believe that anybody can really be a part of it unless they
Mm-hmm.
choose it and want to. There's
Mm-hmm.
no coercion possible because it doesn't count.
Mm-hmm.
It's about relationship with God. You can't coerce somebody into relationship.
I resonate deeply with that idea of you can't coerce people into religion. In fact, I think the reason my relationship with Christianity when I was a Christian was so profound was because I had the opportunity to come to it by choice.
You were choosing it.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I chose God. It really impacted me. Um, and, as a
And when
psychologist,
you left, nobody imposed a penalty on you. Maybe they didn't hang out with you or something, but nobody could force you to stay.
yeah, that's true. Nobody could force you to stay. Though I will say,
There was
as
no death penalty.
no death penalty. As a psychologist, I do appreciate that there is a social, um, just like so many people revered you for the fact that in high school
Uh,
you would be who you were, regardless of how people felt about you. I do appreciate that for most people, their need for belonging is so high that even though it's not a physical death penalty,
they
it's
feel like they can't give it up.
it is so emotionally painful losing family members. And that is perspectives I've heard many times of people who their parents will no longer talk to them. They feel that same level of um, in like worth that you've expressed deriving from Christianity, that you're so loved and accepted by God that you can do tremendous things and tremendous things can happen to you. Um, they get the opposite, that you're so rejected by the people who are supposed to love you
Mm-hmm.
that you are completely debilitated. And so you end up coerced into the faith because you're craving any bit of that acceptance. And so I
And the
think,
chance for it increases depending on how tight the structure is, the group or anything. So we're talking about just you, if you and I are friends, right? We're just hanging out or whatever, and we both believe the same thing. And then you verge away from it through a process of whatever, discovery or whatever. Um, if it's just based on our hanging out and going, we either are going to continue to connect regardless of this divergence in point of view, or drift apart. But I'm not going to come after you or penalize you.
yeah,
But a group might, depending on how tight it was. So you have a much higher bar in leaving the Amish, for example. Although I think at a certain age they let you leave. But boy, there's a disfellowshipping, right? There's a
mm-hmm,
no one's allowed to talk to this family again, or this guy or whoever
Yeah.
left. And that's true. So that would go down depending on how less organized or less intensive the group is.
Yeah.
The
And can
Methodists
you,
don't come after you. They don't even
uh,
notice that you've left.
in my
Maybe in your town they did,
in
but in
my
my town it's like I
experience,
don't think they had any idea I wasn't coming anymore.
yeah, in my experience, that is it depends on the people.
Mm-hmm.
It's not cut and dry. There, even Christianity, it's not cut and dry. Islam, it's not cut and dry. The more that I get to know people of different who come to faith and experience it differently, I've never found a religion where I could make a statement about the religion entirely.
Mm-hmm.
That somebody else has some other perspective, and usually there's commonalities, which I appreciate.
Yeah. I will say, though, just in provable fact, I cannot think of a nation or even a city on earth where there's a law that you're not allowed to stop believing in Christianity. You're not, you cannot renounce Christianity. I don't think there's one spot on the planet where there's a law in effect like that.
That's great.
And
I
but
mean,
there are vast swaths of this planet where it's against the law for you to leave Islam
mhm.
or Hinduism.
I understand. Like there are certainly examples we can all go to. I
Mhm,
personally don't know, um, but I want to pulling back out of comparative religion
mhm,
because I don't want to lose sight of the fact that, and I think it can happen, that in the comparison across religions, just like the comparisons across people, we can lose sight of the lessons that can be
mhm,
gleaned. What you did in Mongolia, what you and your family did there, is you brought hope to a nation that had been lacking it. That you brought in some way, whether or not the person who was laying down, for 10 years crippled, rose. I mean, regardless of anything, that's something we should pay attention to. How the heck did that happen? And I think that's where I try to invite this idea of curiosity into that story. That's really powerful. I want to, as we wrap up this conversation, I mean, we could have a part two, I could even imagine, because you have so many
Can I say
stories.
one thing really quick? You can cut
Yeah,
it out
sure.
too if you want. But the miracles and everything might be this kind of bombshell, big deal kind of thing. But the fact is that these teenage girls that we started out with, I was just back there. It's almost 30 years later, and they are the most amazing people. All of them, it seems, have gone on to become big leaders in the country, leading large groups of people. And these were nobodies. They were from poorer families. They were just teenage girls in high school, most of them. And the comparison between them and their peers today is almost jarring. The stuff they've gone into, one of them works in Switzerland with World Vision and is this big, multinational. Another one said, hey, pray for this group I'm doing for women. This was during COVID. It's going to be on Zoom and I'm nervous about it. But it's only for Christian leader women in Mongolia. So then she sends us a picture afterwards. The Zoom screen has like 95 boxes on it, and it's one of 3 screens. I couldn't believe I'd never seen a Zoom meeting this big. I was like, I did not pray nearly enough for this. I had no idea what she was talking about.
Mm-hmm.
I imagine 12 gals doing a
Mm-hmm.
group Zoom. So, what they've gone on to do, and not just the gals, but guys too. I'm in awe of them, really.
Well, you've given, I mean, as I think you would put it, by bringing the knowledge of God and the opportunity for a relationship with God, they were able to tap into a deep purpose, a deep mission, and that mission did inspire them to do a lot of good. I think that's beautiful. As you zoom out, like thinking
Mm-hmm.
about, you've done a lot. This current season of your life, kind of thinking about now and maybe into the future. What would you say is maybe the current theme or the current title of this chapter, and what's next for you?
Yeah. I'd say the current theme is parenting the movement makers. Um, what we do now is we go out and we get together with young men, young women, in places like Ecuador, Mozambique, Madagascar, uh, South Sudan, although they all got chased out of there, so now it's Uganda. And these are like, they look to us almost as parents. We come and we listen to them and we hear what they're doing, and successes and failures and roadblocks and all of these things, and coach them through some of these things, because they've learned from us. Our initial connection was through training or something. They've embraced these goals and really made them theirs and said, this is what I want to produce in my country for my people. I want to see these kind of things happen. I want to see clinics in every village where they don't have access to health care. I want to see um, maternal death rates go down in birth through midwifery training that we do and stuff like that. So we invest ourselves in them. We raise money so we can afford to go over and spend serious time. We just got back from India, um, investing ourselves in these mostly pretty young people that are wanting to do similar things to what we did. And they really appreciate it because they don't have access to people who really care about them and have a deep interest in their lives and their wellness and everything else, and seeing them reach their goals. And the fact that we would love them enough to come there, live in their homes, which they're aware are a bit different than our home. You know, I'm not naturally taking to squatty potties, but I have to deal with a lot of them.
Mhm.
You know, it's not
Yeah.
my choice, but
So,
it's something I choose to do for the greater good.
so with that being said, a question I like to ask everyone is, what is a core value or life lesson that you aspire to live your life by?
Yeah, keep it simple. I mean, this is like one of the most important things to me. I see the biggest obstacles to the transformational things that we've experienced, that others have experienced through our work and everything, has been when something gets, the more complicated you make something, the less likely anything good is going to come of it. You just get bogged down. And so, yeah, keeping it simple is a big one. And then the other one, which, you know, I don't know, it might have to be a different language for some of the viewers or whatever, but the two big ones for me are keep it simple and trust God's spirit in other people. Don't set up a whole lot of control, or, you know, have this fear that they're going to go wrong or fall off the road or this or that. Trust, you know, once something's been given to somebody, once something's been entrusted to them, you just need to have a radical trust that God will keep his hand on the steering wheel, and it's not on you to try and set up human systems to control the whole thing.
Wow, I love that. Um, that was great. Brian, thank you so much for sharing your perspective. I've certainly learned a lot. I have a lot more to continue to think about, and I appreciate that. There's so many parts of your story that are going to allow me to keep growing as a person, and anyone who listens to this, for us to chew on, wrestle over, and even be inspired by, to recognize there might be other paths to hope that we haven't explored. I think that's incredible. Again, if you want to check out Brian Hogan's work, we've got several books here. We'll list them for you so you can give a look into that. And other than that, is there anything else you want to say?
That we talked earlier about things from childhood and the fighting and stuff like that. And a lot of that's covered in the A to Z book. So some of the, if people want to read just discrete stories from the early years, they're all in there.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Beautiful. Thank you,
Yeah.
Brian.
Thank you.